Blood stained the wheat fields of Pennsylvania crimson as the largest battle ever fought on American soil began with a chance encounter. On the morning of July 1, 1863, Confederate soldiers marching east toward the small market town of Gettysburg in search of shoes stumbled upon Union cavalry. What followed would forever alter the course of American history. General Robert E. Lee had led his Army of Northern Virginia north across the Potomac River, invading Union territory. With audacious confidence after his stunning victory at Chancellorsville, the Confederate leadership believed that a decisive victory on Northern soil might force Abraham Lincoln's government to negotiate peace and recognize Southern independence. Meanwhile, the newly appointed commander of the Union's Army of the Potomac, General George Gordon Meade, had been tasked with intercepting Lee's forces and preventing any assault on northern cities. Neither Lee nor Meade initially planned to fight at Gettysburg, noted historian James McPherson in his Pulitzer Prize-winning work, Battle Cry of Freedom. The battle developed almost by accident, yet it would become the most consequential engagement of the entire war. As Confederate General Henry Heth's division approached Gettysburg from the northwest, they encountered Union Brigadier General John Buford's cavalry division, which had arrived the previous day. Buford, recognizing the strategic importance of the high ground south of town, deployed his men along McPherson's Ridge and Hare Ridge, determined to delay the Confederate advance until infantry reinforcements could arrive. The opening shots rang out at dawn. Buford's troopers, armed with breech-loading carbines, put up a fierce resistance against the larger Confederate force. The sound of gunfire echoed across the rolling Pennsylvania countryside as farm families fled and the small college town braced for the storm that was about to engulf it. By mid-morning, Union Major General John Reynolds arrived with his first corps. Reynolds, one of the most respected officers in the Federal Army, personally led his men into battle. "Forward, men! Forward, for God's sake! And drive those fellows out of the woods," he shouted, rallying the Iron Brigade. Moments later, a Confederate bullet struck him in the neck, killing him instantly. His death steeled the resolve of his men, who fought with renewed determination. Throughout the sweltering day, more troops from both armies converged on Gettysburg. The Union 11th Corps took position north of town, while Confederate divisions, under Generals Richard Ewell and A.P. Hill, pressed the attack. By late afternoon, overwhelming Confederate forces flanked the Union defenders, sending them retreating through the streets of Gettysburg in disarray. As the sun began to set, thousands lay dead or wounded. The fields and woodlots west and north of town bore mute testimony to the day's slaughter. Yet this was merely the opening act. Union forces retreated to the high ground south of town, Cemetery Hill, Culp's Hill, and the ridge that extended south toward two prominent hills, Little Round Top and Big Round Top. That evening, in a farmhouse serving as his headquarters, General Lee conferred with his commanders. His trusted old warhorse, Lieutenant General James Longstreet, advocated for maneuvering around the Union position to force Meade to attack them instead. But Lee, sensing opportunity and believing the Union Army was demoralized, determined to continue the assault the next day. "We've driven them this far," Lee told his generals. "Tomorrow we shall drive them from the heights." "Miles away, General." Meade arrived at the battlefield near midnight, studying maps by candlelight with his staff in a small farmhouse on the Taneytown Road. He approved the defensive position his subordinates had established and issued orders for the remaining corps to concentrate at Gettysburg with all possible speed. The army settled into an uneasy night, treating wounded, counting losses, and preparing for what both sides knew would be an even bloodier day to follow. As campfires dotted the landscape and the summer stars shone above, the fate of the American Republic hung in the balance. The true test was yet to come. Dawn of July 2, 1863, broke hot and humid over the fields of Gettysburg. The sun rose on a landscape transformed overnight into a vast military encampment with over 150,000 men arrayed against each other in a rough fishhook formation. The Union Army held the high ground along Cemetery Ridge, while Confederate forces stretched in a longer concave line from northeast to southwest of the town. General Lee, despite having won the previous day's fighting, found himself at a tactical disadvantage. The Army of the Potomac now occupied the commanding heights, and more Union troops continued to arrive hourly. After reconnaissance, Lee formulated his plan. Longstreet's 1st Corps would attack the Union left flank, while Ewell's 2nd Corps would demonstrate against the right, potentially turning it if opportunity arose. "Let us flank them out of position," Longstreet argued one final time, advocating for a strategic movement around the Union left. "The enemy is there," Lee replied, pointing towards Cemetery Ridge, "and I am going to attack him there." According to historian Stephen W. Sears in his comprehensive work, Gettysburg, this crucial strategic disagreement would have far-reaching consequences. Lee's decision to attack frontally rather than maneuver may have been the single most decisive command decision of the battle, Sears writes. Delays plagued Longstreet's movement into position. Not until 4 o'clock in the afternoon did his assault begin in earnest. His troops surged forward toward the Union position at the Peach Orchard, Wheatfield, and Devil's Den, soon to become infamous names in American military history. Fighting in the Wheatfield defied description. The ground changed hands 6 times in 2 hours as charge and countercharge left the field strewn with dead and wounded. Union General Dan Sickles had advanced his 3rd Corps well ahead of the main Union line without authorization, creating a vulnerable salient that the Confederates exploited. Fierce combat erupted around the Peach Orchard as Confederate artillery pounded the exposed Union position. Meanwhile, at the southern end of the battlefield, one of the most dramatic episodes of the war unfolded. Colonel Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain and his 20th Maine Regiment occupied the extreme left of the Union line on Little Round Top. If this position fell, the entire Union Army would be flanked. Wave after wave of Alabama troops charged uphill against the determined defenders. "We are nearly out of ammunition," Chamberlain's subordinates informed him as the 5th Confederate assault receded. In that desperate moment, Chamberlain ordered what would become one of the most famous tactical decisions of the Civil War: "Fix bayonets. Charge." His exhausted men swept down the rocky slope, surprising the equally exhausted Confederates and securing the vital position. According to historian Bruce Catton in Glory Road, Chamberlain's action may well have saved the entire Union position on Cemetery Ridge. His regiment suffered nearly 40% casualties but never yielded ground. As twilight approached, Confederate forces under General Jubal Early launched a massive assault against the Union right on Cemetery Hill and Culp's Hill. Union artillery fired canister shot point-blank into the attacking ranks, yet still the Confederates came on, briefly securing a foothold before Union reserves drove them back. By nightfall, the battlefield fell silent except for the moans of the wounded. Neither side had achieved decisive victory, though the Union lines, bent but unbroken, still held the high ground. Lee's attempts to crush both flanks of the Federal Army had failed, but at a terrible cost to both sides. In the Union headquarters at the Leicester House, General Meade called a council of war. "Should we stay and fight it out, or should we withdraw?" he asked his corps commanders. The vote was unanimous. They would stand their ground. Meade turned to his chief engineer, General Gouverneur Warren. "What will Lee do tomorrow?" Warren considered for a moment before answering. "If I know anything of Lee, he will attack us." As midnight passed, both armies prepared for what they sensed would be the decisive day of the battle. Lee, despite the failures of July 2nd, remained determined to break the Union center. Across the lines, the Federal troops strengthened their positions, knowing the test that would come with the new day would determine whether their nation would endure or perish from the earth. July 3rd, 1863 dawned with the smell of gunpowder still hanging in the morning air. Fighting had continued through the night on Culp's Hill, where Union forces successfully repelled Confederate attempts to take the position. By mid-morning, the Union right flank was secure, and an eerie calm settled over the battlefield as both armies recovered and repositioned. In the Confederate headquarters at the Thompson House, General Robert E. Lee made his fateful decision. Having attacked both Union flanks without decisive result, he now focused on what he perceived as the weakened Union center along Cemetery Ridge. He called upon General George Pickett's fresh division from Longstreet's corps, along with troops from A.P. Hill's corps, to make the main assault. "General Longstreet," Lee said, I wish you to prepare an attack using Pickett's division and whatever forces you deem necessary. Longstreet, who had argued against frontal assaults throughout the campaign, made one final attempt to dissuade his commander. It is my opinion that no 15,000 men ever arrayed for battle can take that position, he warned. Lee was unmoved. The artillery chief, Colonel E. Porter Alexander, was instructed to place over 150 guns in position to soften the Union center before the infantry attack. According to the diary of Confederate artillery officer Major Robert Stiles, Pickett approached Longstreet for final orders. When directed to prepare his division for the assault, Pickett saluted and said, "I shall lead my division forward, sir." Longstreet, too overcome with emotion at what he believed would be a futile sacrifice, merely nodded in response. At 1:00 in the afternoon, the Confederate artillery opened fire in the largest bombardment ever witnessed on the North American continent. For nearly 2 hours, the air filled with shot and shell as Federal batteries returned fire. The earth trembled under the concussion of over 200 guns in simultaneous action. "The very earth shook beneath our feet," wrote Union Lieutenant Frank Haskell in his famous account of the battle, "and the hills and rocks seemed to reel like a drunken man." When the Confederate guns finally fell silent to conserve ammunition for the infantry support, Union Artillery Chief General Henry Hunt ordered his own guns to cease firing, not because they were disabled, as the Confederates believed, but to cool the overheated barrels and prepare for the infantry assault he knew would follow. At approximately 3:00, nearly 13,000 Confederate soldiers emerged from the woods along Seminary Ridge. In parade ground formation, battle, flags flying, they began the 3/4-mile march across open fields toward the Union position. It was a magnificent and terrible sight. Union General Winfield Scott Hancock, commanding the center of the Federal line, rode calmly along his position as enemy shells still occasionally burst overhead. "Their attack will be made right here," he predicted, pointing to a small copse of trees that would forever after be known as the Angle. As the Confederate lines came within range, Union artillery opened fire with devastating effect, first with solid shot, then shell, and finally canister, turning their cannon into giant shotguns that tore great gaps in the Southern ranks. Still, the gray lines closed up and continued forward. "Here they come! Here they come!" shouted Union soldiers along Cemetery Ridge as they rose to meet the assault. The Confederates, now under fire from their front and both flanks, broke into a charge over the final few hundred yards. A small contingent under Brigadier General Lewis Armistead, with his hat raised high on his sword as a guide, managed to breach the Union line at the Angle, laying hands on Federal cannon in what became known as the high water mark of the Confederacy, the furthest point reached by Southern forces. The breakthrough was momentary. Union reserves rushed to the gap, and savage hand-to-hand fighting ensued. Within 30 minutes, the Confederate assault collapsed. Armistead fell mortally wounded within yards of his old friend, Union General Hancock, who was also wounded. The survivors of Pickett's charge streamed back toward Seminary Ridge, pursued by Union fire. When Pickett returned to Confederate lines, Lee met him personally. "General Pickett," he said, "place your division in rear of this hill and be ready to repel the enemy should they follow up their advantage." "General Lee," Pickett replied with tears in his eyes, "I have no division now." Of the nearly 13,000 men who made the charge, more than half were casualties. Pickett's division alone lost 2/3 of its men and all of its field officers except Pickett himself. As evening approached, rain began to fall, washing blood into the soil of Pennsylvania. The great gamble had failed. The Army of Northern Virginia had reached its high water mark, and now the long ebb would begin. By nightfall on July 3, 1863, the fields around Gettysburg had become a vast mortuary. Over 50,000 Americans lay dead, wounded, or missing, nearly 1/3 of the combined forces that had met in battle. The greatest slaughter in American history had come to its bloody conclusion, though the full implications would not be realized for months to come. General Lee, accepting the failure of Pickett's charge, took full responsibility. "It's all my fault," he told his returning officers. "I thought my men were invincible." That evening, amid a driving rainstorm, he ordered preparations for retreat. The wounded who could be moved were loaded into wagon trains stretching 17 miles, the longest ambulance convoy in the war's history. According to historian James McPherson, the night of July 3rd was perhaps the lowest point in Lee's career as a commander. His gamble had failed catastrophically, and now he faced the daunting task of returning his battered army to Virginia with a vengeful enemy at his heels. Union General George Meade, though victorious, was cautious. At a council of war that night, some of his subordinates urged immediate pursuit and counterattack, but Meade, aware of his army's own heavy losses and exhaustion, decided on a more measured approach. This decision would later draw criticism from President Lincoln, who believed the opportunity to destroy Lee's army had been missed. "We had them within our grasp," Lincoln later lamented. "We had only to stretch forth our hands, and they were ours." On July 4th, Independence Day, as Americans throughout the loyal states received news of victory at Gettysburg, the Confederate retreat began. The same day, far to the west, Vicksburg surrendered to General Ulysses S. Grant, giving the Union control of the Mississippi River and effectively splitting the Confederacy. The twin Union victories marked the beginning of the end for the Southern cause, though 21 months of bloody fighting still lay ahead. The retreat of Lee's army was hampered by the same rainstorm that had begun on the evening of July 3rd. The Potomac River, swollen by the downpour, became impassable, temporarily trapping the Army of Northern Virginia on the northern bank. For several days, Lee's forces entrenched around Williamsport, Maryland, expecting a Union assault that never came in force. According to Confederate General John B. Gordon's post-war memoir, Reminiscences of the Civil War, the Army's morale remained surprisingly intact, despite the defeat. "There was no thought among us that our cause was lost. The Army's faith in Lee was undiminished, and we looked forward to future victories under his leadership." By July 14th, the waters had receded enough for Lee's army to cross back into Virginia. Meade's pursuit had been tentative, allowing the bulk of the Confederate force to escape destruction. President Lincoln's frustration was captured in a letter to General Halleck. "We had them within our grasp. The war could have been ended. I am very, very sad." Meanwhile, Gettysburg itself had been transformed. Every church, public building, and many private homes had become makeshift hospitals. The town's population of 2,400 suddenly found themselves caring for over 20,000 wounded soldiers from both armies. The civilian toll was also severe, as documented by historian Gregory Coco in A Strange and Blighted Land. Farms were destroyed, crops trampled, and livestock killed. The stench of death hung over the landscape as hastily dug shallow graves proved inadequate. Disease threatened the population as the summer heat intensified. On November 19, 1863, President Lincoln arrived in Gettysburg to dedicate a national cemetery for the Union dead. Following a 2-hour oration by the celebrated Edward Everett, Lincoln rose to deliver a few appropriate remarks that would become the most famous speech in American history. In just 272 words, the Gettysburg Address transformed the meaning of the war from a constitutional struggle to preserve the Union into a new birth of freedom that would ensure that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. The New York Times reported, "The dedicatory remarks by President Lincoln will live among the annals of man." As 1863 drew to a close, the strategic implications of Gettysburg became clearer. Never again would Confederate forces launch a major invasion of Northern territory. The initiative had passed permanently to the Union. Though the war would continue for almost 2 more years, the outcome had been determined on those 3 fateful days in July when the tide of the rebellion reached its crest and began to recede. The toll of Gettysburg extended far beyond military calculations and strategic assessments. As August 1863 dawned hot and humid, the human tragedy continued to unfold in dimensions almost beyond comprehension. The battle that had lasted just 3 days would leave wounds that would take generations to heal. In the hospitals surrounding Gettysburg, surgeons worked around the clock, performing amputations at a rate of nearly 1 per minute during the peak of medical operations. The primitive state of Civil War medicine meant that infection claimed many who had survived their initial wounds, Chloroform and ether were in short supply, and many operations were performed with little or no anesthesia. "I have seen the stacks of amputated limbs rise as high as a man," wrote Walt Whitman, who served as a nurse during the war. Though not present at Gettysburg, his descriptions of military hospitals captured the horror that followed every major engagement. Some men, after having a leg amputated, never recovered consciousness. Others endured the procedure with nothing more than a plug of tobacco to bite down upon. According to historian Drew Gilpin Faust in her groundbreaking work, This Republic of Suffering, the unprecedented scale of death at Gettysburg challenged existing Victorian notions about the good death. Families who received telegrams informing them of a loved one's fall often had no body to bury, no grave to visit, no opportunity for proper mourning rituals. Elizabeth Thorne, the caretaker of Evergreen Cemetery in Gettysburg, was 6 months pregnant when the battle erupted around her home. After the fighting ended, she helped bury 105 soldiers in the summer heat before giving birth. Her story, documented in the cemetery's archives, represents the overlooked civilian cost of the battle. For African Americans, Gettysburg held special significance. Although the Emancipation Proclamation had technically freed slaves in Confederate territory on January 1, 1863, it had little practical effect until Union military success could enforce its provisions. Gettysburg represented a turning point that would eventually lead to freedom's reality. As noted by historian Alan C. Guelzo, in Gettysburg: The Last Invasion, Confederate forces had captured free blacks during their advance into Pennsylvania and sent them south into slavery. The battle's outcome quite literally determined whether freedom or bondage would be the fate of many black Americans in the border regions, Guelzo writes. The Confederate retreat also marked a psychological turning point. Southern diarist Mary Chesnut captured the shift in mood. "We are certainly gone if something is not done." Crowds of women rushed to the War Department for news. They had heard that their sons or husbands or brothers were among the killed at Gettysburg. Northern spirits, conversely, soared. The New York Tribune proclaimed, "The power of the rebellion in the East is broken. The charm of Robert E. Lee's invincibility is dissolved." For the common soldiers, the experience of Gettysburg left indelible marks. Union Colonel Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, the hero of Little Round Top, wrote years later, "In great deeds, something abides. On great fields, something stays. Forms change and pass, bodies disappear, but spirits linger to consecrate ground for the vision place of souls." The battle's legacy extended to the home front in unexpected ways. The severe depletion of male population in some communities led to profound social changes. Women took on new roles, managing farms and businesses. Children grew up fatherless. The Sanitary Commission and other civilian relief efforts expanded exponentially to meet the overwhelming need. Matthew Brady's photographic team, led by Alexander Gardner, arrived at Gettysburg soon after the battle, capturing haunting images of the dead that shocked the nation when displayed in New York. For the first time, Americans far from the battlefield confronted the war's true cost through the new medium of photography. Gardner's caption for one image read simply, "As they fell." The Christian Commission, founded to provide spiritual comfort to soldiers, distributed over 50,000 Bibles and prayer books to the wounded at Gettysburg. Volunteers read to those who could not hold books themselves, wrote letters for the dying, and provided what comfort they could amid scenes of almost unimaginable suffering. By autumn, as the hastily buried dead were exhumed for proper reinterment, in the new National Cemetery, the nation was still processing what had occurred. The magnitude of loss was without precedent in American experience. Nearly 7,000 had died outright during the battle, with thousands more succumbing to wounds in the weeks that followed. Gettysburg had become hallowed ground, sanctified by sacrifice on a scale that transformed the national consciousness. The war would rage for 21 more months, claiming hundreds of thousands of additional lives, but something fundamental had changed in the American soul during those 3 days in July. A nation conceived in liberty had been forced to confront the full cost of its contradictions, and through this baptism of fire, a new understanding of nationhood began to emerge. The nation moved into 1864 and beyond, Gettysburg increasingly took on mythic proportions in the American consciousness. What had begun as one battle among many transformed into the defining moment of the conflict, the hinge upon which the nation's fate had turned. Its significance grew, rather than diminished with the passage of time. For the remainder of the war, the Army of Northern Virginia would never regain the offensive capability it had possessed before Gettysburg. Though Lee's military genius would allow him to prolong the struggle, the strategic initiative remained firmly with the Union until Appomattox. Grant's relentless pressure in the Virginia campaign of 1864, combined with Sherman's march to the sea, finally broke the Confederacy's ability to resist. According to historian Gary W. Gallagher in The Confederate War, after Gettysburg, the question was no longer whether the Union would prevail, but when and at what additional cost in blood and treasure. When peace finally came in April 1865, survivors of Gettysburg were among the first to return to the battlefield. Veterans organizations such as the Grand Army of the Republic organized pilgrimages to the site, seeking to make sense of their experiences and to honor fallen comrades. The first reunion at Gettysburg occurred in 1869, with former enemies meeting on the field as countrymen once more. But it was the 50th anniversary in 1913 that captured national attention. Over 50,000 aged veterans, both blue and gray, gathered on the battlefield. Former Confederate soldiers, many in their 70s and 80s, reenacted Pickett's charge, walking across the same open field they had charged across half a century earlier. This time, they were met at the stone wall not with miniballs and canister shot, but with handshakes and embraces from their former enemies. As reported in the Philadelphia Inquirer, old men who had fought with the fury of tigers wept in each other's arms yesterday on the field of Gettysburg. Half a century of peacetime had healed the wounds of 4 years of war. President Woodrow Wilson addressed the assembled veterans. "We have found one another again as brothers and comrades in arms, enemies no longer, generous friends rather. Our battles long past, the quarrel forgotten. Yet this reconciliation came at a cost, as noted by historian David W. Blight in Race and Reunion. The emphasis on healing between white Americans of North and South often obscured the war's central legacy of emancipation. The narrative of sectional reconciliation frequently overshadowed the ongoing struggle for full citizenship and equality for Black Americans, a struggle that would continue through Reconstruction, Jim Crow, and into the civil rights movement of the 20th century. The battlefield itself underwent transformation. Beginning with the creation of the Soldiers' National Cemetery, preservation efforts gradually expanded to protect the entire battlefield. In 1895, Gettysburg became one of the first 5 military parks established by the federal government. States erected monuments honoring their fallen sons, eventually placing over 1,400 memorials across the landscape, making Gettysburg the largest collection of outdoor sculpture in America. The battle's strategic and tactical lessons became required study at military academies worldwide. European observers incorporated lessons from Gettysburg into their military doctrine, though few heeded the warnings about the deadly effectiveness of defensive firepower, leading to catastrophic casualties in the early phases of World War I. American culture, Gettysburg became a touchstone of national identity. When the United States entered subsequent conflicts, from the Spanish-American War through World Wars I and II, political leaders frequently invoked the sacrifice at Gettysburg to rally public support. The mystic chords of memory that Lincoln had referenced continued to resonate. Perhaps most significantly, Gettysburg marked the beginning of a fundamental transformation in how Americans understood their nation. Before the battle, Americans commonly used the phrase "the United States are," a grammatical construction that emphasized the primacy of individual states joined in voluntary union. After Gettysburg and through the remainder of the 19th century, usage gradually shifted to "the United States is," reflecting the emergence of a singular national identity forged in the crucible of conflict. As historian Bruce Catton observed in This Hallowed Ground, the United States had a new birth of freedom, just as Lincoln had said, and faced the even more difficult task of making it real. Gettysburg had helped the nation find its soul, but the journey to fully realize its ideals had only begun. By the early 21st century, Nearly 2 million visitors annually walked the grounds of Gettysburg, standing on the same terrain where North and South had clashed in the battle that defined America. From Seminary Ridge, across the Emmitsburg Road, to the stone wall at Cemetery Ridge, modern pilgrims traced the steps of Pickett's men, contemplating the courage and sacrifice that had preserved the Union and set in motion the long process of national redemption. In the words of Joshua Chamberlain, who had helped save the Union left flank at Little Round Top and who later presided over the Confederate surrender at Appomattox, "In great deeds, something abides. On great fields, something stays. Generations that know us not and that we know not of, heart drawn to see where and by whom great things were suffered and done for them, shall come to this deathless field, to ponder and dream. And lo, the shadow of a mighty presence shall wrap them in its bosom, and the power of the vision pass into their souls." Thus Gettysburg remains, in our national consciousness, not merely the turning point of a war long past, but an enduring symbol of the price of freedom and the ongoing American experiment in democracy.